They were lifting my dad's Mustang onto a tow truck in broad daylight, like they owned the whole street. And my neighbors were just standing there watching, thinking it was some kind of official police operation, instead of a robbery in uniform. And I remember this heavy, sick feeling in my chest, like they were hauling a piece of me up that ramp along with the car. The chains were screeching. The fake cops in Navy uniforms were barking orders. Our HOA president was standing at the curb with a clipboard, like a judge sending someone off to prison. And that midnight blue Mustang, the last real thing I had left of my father, bounced on the metal like it was nothing. I let it get right to that point, right up to the edge. Then I walked out, dropped my old FBI badge on the hood with a loud metallic clang, and said, calm as I could, "Step away from my car." Now. And in that second, the whole neighborhood realized the people they'd been obeying weren't cops at all. 3 weeks earlier, if you had told me I'd be pulling a badge on HOA security in a quiet suburb, I would have laughed because I moved to Cypress Ridge to get away from all that, away from liars with titles and people who hide behind rules to push everyone around. You know what I mean? I just wanted a boring little street where the biggest drama was whose trash can tipped over in the wind. My name's Ethan Cole. I spent 15 years with the Bureau chasing financial criminals who thought paperwork made them untouchable. And when I retired, I honestly believed I was done with adrenaline, done with lies, done with the part of me that always had to be on guard. I traded that in for a one-story house, a quiet neighborhood, and a driveway big enough for one thing that still mattered to me. That one thing was my dad's 1968 Mustang midnight blue chrome bumpers. You could practically shave in the car he'd ordered brand new, back when seatbelts were optional and gas was cheap. The car he taught me to drive in the car. He left me when he passed. For me, it wasn't some trophy. It was his voice on long drives, and his hands guiding mine on a wrench. It was all the times he said, "Some things are worth fighting for, kid," while we stood over that engine bay getting grease on everything we owned. That Mustang was family on 4 wheels. Cypress Ridge looked like the right place to park that history. Wide streets, big trees, kids playing basketball in cul-de-sacs, neighbors who waved with the same hand they used to hold a rake. The kind of place where you think the worst thing that can happen is a package getting stolen off a porch. For a while, that was true. The only things in my mailbox were coupons and friendly little HOA newsletters about seasonal flowers and community barbecues. And I thought, yeah, maybe this is it. Maybe I finally get to be just some guy washing his car in the driveway. Then the HOA had an election, and everything changed behind a nice smile and a PowerPoint. We got a new president, a woman named Karen Blackwood, who walked into the clubhouse like she was running for senator, not head of a homeowners association. Perfect hair. This polished voice about protecting our investments and raising standards. And everybody in the folding chairs nodded along, because nobody wants to be the only person who doesn't care about safety and property values. She talked about weeds and paint colors and mailbox heights, the usual annoying but harmless stuff. And then she clicked to a slide with a shiny logo that said, Cypress Ridge Community Safety Unit. And that was the first time my stomach did that little twist. She said, "We're launching our own safety division. They'll patrol the neighborhood, enforce violations, keep our community secure." And people clapped like they'd just been handed free security guards. Meanwhile, I'm in the back thinking we already have police. Why does a neighborhood with a duck pond need its own unit? But I was tired. I was the new guy. And after years of being the one who always raised his hand and poked holes in bad ideas, I just let it slide. Figured maybe they'd hire a couple of rent-a-cops in polos, drive around, wave at kids. Nothing serious. The first sign I was wrong came a few mornings later while I was doing what retired guys do. Coffee in one hand, chamois in the other, working slow circles across that Mustang's hood, watching the sun come up over a quiet street. When I saw my neighbor Mrs. Jenkins hustling across the road like she'd just seen a ghost. She's in her 70s, been in Cypress Ridge since before half these houses existed. The kind of lady who brings casseroles when someone's sick. Not the kind who panics, but her hands were shaking around a stack of papers, and her voice was barely steady when she said, "Ethan." They came to my door, the new safety people. They had uniforms, badges, radios. They said they needed to inspect my car. Said I had to sign this or they could fine me, maybe even tow it. And I took the top sheet from her, glanced at it, and at first glance, sure it looked official. There were headings and boxes and bold words like violation and compliance. But the more I read, the more that old part of my brain kicked in. The one trained to smell a scam because there was no city seal, no statute numbers, no reference to any actual law. Just the HOA logo and a made-up name, Cypress Ridge Community Safety Unit, with a generic email address, like you'd use for a church newsletter. I asked if she'd read it before she signed, and she looked small, standing there in my driveway. They told me if I didn't sign right away, they could report me for non-cooperation. And you know how they talk about liens and things. I got scared. And that's when the anger started. Not the loud kind, the cold kind. Because people like that always pick someone like her to test their power on first. I told her, "Listen, any paper they shove in your face from now on, you bring it to me first, all right?" And she nodded, clutching those forms to her chest, like maybe they could still explode. About 10 minutes later, I heard an engine and looked up to see a white SUV creeping down our street, moving slow and deliberate, like it was on patrol light. Bar on top dark. Tint big decals reading, "Community Safety." And if you didn't know any better, you'd swear it was some new branch of law enforcement. You know what I mean, because from a distance authority, all kind of looks the same. It stopped at my driveway. The window rolled down, and the man behind the wheel gave me this practiced, serious look, AV uniform, peaked cap badge on his chest that caught the light a little too perfectly. Radio clipped to his shoulder. "Mr. Cole?" he asked. "Yeah," I answered. "I'm Officer Wade Fletcher, with the Cypress Ridge Community Safety Unit," he said, tapping his badge like it meant something. "We've had some concerns about your vehicle here. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I glanced back at the Mustang sitting there, exactly where it always sits. Tags valid, inspection sticker current, not hurting anybody. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He looked down at his clipboard. "This is a high-value classic car, and under our new safety ordinance, we have to verify that vehicles like this are not being used for commercial purposes in a residential zone. It's just routine. If we don't get the proper documentation, we may have to impound the vehicle until your status is clear," he said, like he was reciting lines he'd rehearsed in a mirror. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so brazen. And I said, "Okay, which ordinance? Exactly." "City, county, state. What statute are you enforcing here?" And he did that thing where his eyes flick over your shoulder instead of looking at you. Then he said, "All of that is detailed in the notice we're sending to your address. You'll have 72 hours to respond. We appreciate your cooperation." And with that, he rolled up his window and drove off like the conversation was over and his authority was unquestionable. As soon as he turned the corner, I took my phone out and snapped pictures of his plates, the decal on the door. The little details people don't think about unless they've spent years testifying about them under oath. Then I went inside, and I waited for the paper I knew was coming. Sure enough, that afternoon, there it was stuffed in my mailbox, under a pizza coupon. A vehicle compliance citation with my name, my address, my Mustang's plate. Paragraphs of vague, legal-sounding mush about high-value assets and public safety, all funneling down to one threat buried in the middle: failure to comply may result in immediate impoundment. I sat at my kitchen table, and for a second I felt exactly what they wanted me to feel. That temptation to think, just give them what they want. Ethan, it's not worth the headache. Just hand over some paperwork so they leave you alone. Because that's how bullies in suits and uniforms win. They wear you down until you confuse compliance with peace. Then I thought about my dad, working double shifts to keep that car about Mrs. Jenkins signing something she didn't understand, because she was afraid. And that feeling flipped from tempted to done, being quiet. Done, giving people like that the benefit of the doubt. The next morning at 8 on the dot, the doorbell hit that sharp double chime that just sounds like trouble. I checked the peephole, and this time it wasn't just Fletcher, it was the full cast. Karen was on my porch in a navy version of her HOA outfit, now with stripes on the sleeves and a supervisor badge, flanked by 2 big guys in matching uniforms, with belts full of gear and faces set in that fake neutral expression people wear when they're trying to look official. I opened the door, and she smiled that tight smile I'd seen at the clubhouse. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. We're here to conduct the inspection of your vehicle. It's standard procedure for high-value cars," she said, already lifting her folder like I had agreed to something. "I didn't request or agree to any inspection," I told her, keeping one hand on the doorframe so they didn't just drift inside. "It's mandatory under Section 15, 3 of our community safety bylaws," she replied. Voice cooling, refusal to cooperate can result in fines, further enforcement, even legal action. None of us wants that. She handed me a multi-page form that somehow managed to say everything and nothing at once. A masterpiece of manipulative writing that basically boiled down to this: if I signed, I was agreeing that they could come inspect whenever they wanted, seize what they wanted if they decided I wasn't compliant, and that I wouldn't hold them accountable later because I had consented. "Just sign here to acknowledge today's inspection," she said, tapping the line with a pen. "And we can keep this simple." I took my time, flipped through, saw enough to know exactly what game this was. Then I looked up and said, "I don't sign anything my attorney hasn't read. So the answer is no." The smile snapped off her face like someone flipped a switch, then came back, thinner, sharper. "You understand this will trigger mandatory escalation," she said. "You do what you have to do, Karen," I said, "and so will I." When they left, I knew I had just moved from annoying to target, and strangely, that's when my fear settled down, and my training came back, because now it was officially a fight. I started knocking on doors, having real conversations, not just, "How about that weather?" And it felt like opening a closet and watching skeletons fall out one by one. Daniel, the quiet guy with the nice Porsche, who always waved, but never talked much, finally told me about the morning. Those same uniforms showed up and took his car, said it violated community noise standards, said he could appeal to the board. Then somehow his car ended up auctioned through some HOA process he never understood. And when he tried to get the city involved, they threatened to fine him for harassing officials. The widow 2 streets over had her late husband's Camaro taken, because someone saw a photo of her at a charity car show and reported her for commercial use. And when she pushed back, they started sending letters about liens and legal costs. Different stories, same pattern. Uniforms at the door, threats, confusion, shame, and every time the victim walked away feeling smaller, like maybe they had done something wrong just by owning something nice. I called the county sheriff's office and asked if they had any agreement with a Cypress Ridge Community Safety Unit. They didn't. I called the city. They hadn't heard of it. I called the clerk's office to ask about any ordinance that would give a neighborhood its own mini police force. Nothing. Then I called an old partner at the bureau, sent him photos of the SUVs, the decals, and the name of a shell company printed in tiny letters on one of the notices, Summit Neighborhood Asset Services, LLC. A little while later, he called me back and said, "So your HOA president, Karen Blackwood, her real name is Karen Lawson, and she's got a prior conviction for impersonating law enforcement and auto theft in another state. Plus, there's still an open warrant for violating parole. And guess who owns Summit Neighborhood Asset Services?" I just stood there in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, thinking we didn't just elect a strict HOA president. We invited a professional criminal to run the rules. After that, it wasn't about one Mustang anymore. It was about everybody on that street who'd been bullied into thinking this was normal. I started saving every document, every voicemail, every email. I re-aimed my security cameras so they had a perfect view of my driveway. I kept my old partner and the sheriff in the loop, and together we came up with a plan that sounded simple, but took every bit of patience I had. Let them think they're winning. Let them go all the way. This time, catch them in the act, with witnesses and recordings, then shut the whole thing down so hard it doesn't happen to anyone else. The final notice arrived like clockwork, big, bold letters, threatening language telling me I was in serious violation, warning that if I didn't show up for a compliance hearing at the community center at a specific time, my Mustang would be impounded for public safety, and we decided I wasn't going to play along with their fake hearing. So instead, on the day and time, they set the sheriff's office and federal agents staged quietly around the neighborhood in unmarked cars. Radios ready, waiting for the moment that white tow truck rolled onto my driveway and those fake cops crossed from HOA harassment into felony theft. My job that morning was simple in theory, complicated in practice. Stand there, don't lose my temper, and let them dig their own grave. At 10 o'clock sharp, the show arrived. 2 white SUVs turning the corner in tight formation, tow truck rumbling behind them. Light bars off, but decals shining like a little parade of pretend authority rolling right up to my house. Neighbors came out pretending to get the mail, pretending to water plants, but really just watching with that familiar dread, because by then everyone knew what it meant when the safety unit parked in front of your place. They lined up perfectly in my driveway. Doors opened, and out stepped Karen, in full uniform. Dark sunglasses, stripes, polished boots, clipboard under one arm, with 2 officers behind her, carrying chains and a camera. And I swear, she strutted like the concrete belonged to her personally. "Mr. Cole," she called, making sure her voice carried down the block. "This is your final opportunity to comply with the decision of the compliance board. Do you have the documents we requested?" I walked out with my coffee barefoot on the warm driveway and said, "No, but I'm still waiting to see any real law behind what you're doing." She didn't even bother pretending this time. She pulled out a paper and read, "Under Section 12.7 of the Community Safety Act, your vehicle has been deemed a risk to community standards and is subject to immediate impoundment. Your refusal to cooperate leaves us no choice." Then she turned to her guys and said, "Proceed with seizure." and they moved fast, because for them, this was just another morning at work. One wrapped chains under the front of my Mustang. The other started snapping photos and narrating nonsense codes into his radio like he'd seen on TV. The tow truck driver backed up with this wary look, like he knew something was off, but figured the paperwork meant he was covered. Across the street, I saw Mrs. Jenkins gripping her railing, Daniel standing there with his jaw set. People I'd waved to for months now watching. Thinking, here we go again. There goes another one. And I let it go, right up to that awful moment where the chains tightened. The front wheels lifted my father's car, hanging off my driveway like a trophy they were taking. That's when I walked over, set my coffee on the curb, and reached for the badge I hadn't carried on my belt in years. It felt heavier than I remembered, dented at the edges, still real in a way everything about this situation wasn't. I didn't give a speech. I didn't shout. I just opened the case, took it out, and dropped it right in the middle of the hood. The clang it made echoed down the street, cutting through the whine of the tow truck and the fake radio chatter, and every single head turned. "Name's Ethan Cole," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Former Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, step away from my vehicle. Now." One fake cop froze with his hand on the chain. The other lowered the camera like someone had unplugged him. The tow truck driver took his hand off the controls, like they'd just turned into a hot stove. For a second, Karen just stared shock all over her face. Then she did what people like her always do when they get cornered. She tried to twist it. "Everyone, please pay attention," she shouted. "Mr. Cole is attempting to intimidate local officers with federal credentials. This is exactly the abuse of power. We created the safety unit to protect you from Officer Hayes, place him under arrest for obstructing a lawful enforcement action." Hayes shifted his weight fingers, brushing the cuffs on his belt, and for a heartbeat or two, it was dead silent, because my neighbors were stuck between uniforms and a badge between the story they'd been fed for months and the truth their gut was starting to scream at them. You know what I mean. They were trying to decide who the problem really was. I smiled, not because I wasn't angry or scared, but because I knew this was the crack in the armor. "Before you arrest me, officer," I said, "what's your badge number?" He blinked. "What?" he said. "Your badge number," I repeated a little louder. "Real cops know theirs, like they know their birthday, so go ahead. What is it?" He opened his mouth, closed it again, looked over at Karen like maybe she'd write the answer on a flashcard, and nothing came out. I turned to the other guy. "You then, which academy did you graduate from, what year? Who was your chief?" And he just stared at me, and in that silence, the whole act melted. So I turned to the people watching and I said, "They're not police. There is no Cypress Ridge Community Safety Unit in any county or city record. This is a car theft ring using fake uniforms and fake rules, and your president is actually a convicted felon named Karen Lawson, who already went to prison for doing this somewhere else." That was the moment everything tilted. Neighbors started pulling out their phones, someone said. "I knew it." Daniel stepped forward and pointed at her and said, "That's exactly how they took my car." And I heard Mrs. Jenkins whisper, "Oh my God." And way down the street, I finally heard what I'd been waiting for. Sirens, real ones, getting closer. 2 sheriff's cruisers turned into Cypress Ridge, with their lights going no decals, pretending to be something they weren't. The deputies stepped out with that calm, solid presence real authority carries, and the leadman walked straight to Karen. Looked at her uniform, then at the printout I'd given him earlier, and said, "Ma'am, are you also known as Karen Lawson?" She tried to launch into some speech about being the HOA president, and enforcing community rules. But he cut her off gently. "Ma'am, there is a warrant for your arrest for impersonating law enforcement and auto theft. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Hearing those words on my driveway, where she'd been holding court for months, was like watching a storm finally break. And yeah, I'm not going to lie, hearing the cuffs click closed around her wrists felt good. Not in a petty way, but in a deep, down, this is how it should be way. One of the fake officers tried to run, but Daniel and another neighbor stepped into his path without even talking about it. Just two tired homeowners who'd finally had enough, and the deputy took him down. In about 2 seconds, the other guy didn't get much farther, and the tow truck driver threw his hands up and started explaining. He thought it was all legitimate. The cars were searched, the paperwork collected, the cameras seized. They put Karen in the back of a real cruiser, and as it pulled away, she looked at me through the window. No more smile, no more lectures. Community standards. Just this flat hatred, and underneath it, fear. And for the first time since she showed up in our lives, the fear wasn't ours. It was hers. When the street finally quieted down, and the last patrol car turned the corner, the Mustang was back on all four wheels in my driveway. The chains were gone. My neighbors were standing there, kind of shell-shocked, and I had this weird mix of relief and anger and something else, responsibility maybe, humming in my chest. I thought that was the end of it. Neat little bow. Fake cops and real handcuffs of cars eventually returned. HOA gutted and rebuilt. Lesson learned about questioning anyone who shows up in a uniform you've never heard of. And for a few weeks, that's exactly how it felt like. We'd finally woken up from a bad dream, and the sun was shining again. Then one afternoon, I was in the garage replacing the old floor mats in the Mustang, lifted the driver's seat just a little higher than usual, and my hand brushed against something that didn't belong there. A little black box tucked up under the rail with a dead blinking light on it. It was a GPS tracker. Not the cheap kind you buy online. A good one. The kind used by people who know what they're doing. And it definitely hadn't been there the day those fake cops tried to take my car. I ran the serial through some old channels I probably shouldn't still know how to access. And the hits I saw were not the kind of things you link to an HOA scam, more like old government contracts, defense projects, serial numbers connected to files. My dad's name happened to show up next to, in a way I'd never noticed before. That's when it hit me that maybe my father's Mustang wasn't just sentimental. Maybe it had been important to someone else for a long time. The kind of people who don't wear crooked decals or carry fake badges. And then I had to ask myself if the tracker was new, or if it had been there for years, and only now decided to die. So yeah, I took down an HOA president, exposed a fake police force, helped my neighbors get their dignity back. But some nights, I still lie awake and wonder how many layers of authority are out there that we never think to question until it's too late. And that's what I want to ask you if a group showed up on your street tomorrow, in uniforms with shiny badges and an official-sounding name. Would you ask for badge numbers, statutes, real city departments, or would you do what most of my neighbors did at first and just obey? Because that's what we're trained to do. Do you think I was right to bait them the way I did, to let them get that close just to catch them? Or did I go too far? And what would you have done if it were your car? Your dad's legacy, your neighborhood on the line. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you trust HOAs. If you've ever seen power abused in the name of rules or safety, and if you've got a story like that from your own street, I really want to hear it. Because the more we talk about this stuff, the harder it is for the next fake badge to scare people into staying quiet.